Howdy, howdy. Sidlevel here, and welcome to the wrap-up video of our infantry testing between 601 and 900 gold. In this video, I'm going to sort of review the list and look at a few of the key units that were sort of out of order and show a little bit of back testing, and then I will look at sort of how I think about how the units should stratify and where they should generally show up, and the general philosophy I think that would be useful in making the game more intuitive for new players and making things just clearer for everybody, because I do still see even pretty good players struggling to think about these units correctly because they don't actually do some units don't actually do what you think they might do. And sort of how I see really good players or intuitive players describe this is they'll say the unit just doesn't feel that good, or the unit is kind of on the weak side, or they sort of describe it in subjective terms, but they can feel or get a sense of units that don't work the way they should, but they still end up picking them because they fit into the slot, like an armor piercing or anti-infantry or anti-large type of thing. And when units don't perform to their actual description, it actually hurts all players, but especially hurts new players. So first of all, I want to go and show some of the back testing that I did to look at whether the basic evaluation of these units sort of made sense. And for example, Savage Orc Big Guns came in at number 2 in this list. Like this is the original list from 1 to 28. So Chaos Warriors, the Great Weapons, come in at number 1, most valuable, and number 28 is Dwarf Slayers, and that's an addition. This is sort of the sum of all the testing where they added up. And the way I do this is, if I'm looking at the gold differential against Dwarf Warriors, I rank order them from 1 to 28. And I do that the same with everything else, and then I add up all of their rank orders to get a total, and then I sequence those, and I get an approximately 1 through 28, so that it's sort of an amalgamation of different levels of testing. So then after I'm done, I tend to do a little bit of back testing just to make sure I didn't make any bad mistakes, or the assumptions that I made when I did the analysis are reasonable. This isn't the end-all and be-all of testing. I know I say it all the time, but I do want it to be a reasonable way to do this, because this is a good way to use data to shortcut a massive amount of testing. Because if I wanted to test every unit against every other unit in this list, it would take a massive amount of time to do that, and the list would be a little bit better, a little more accurate, but it wouldn't be that much better, and that's why I do the back testing. So first of all, I want to show some of the back testing, particularly these Savage Orc Big Guns, because they came in at number 2 and in an infantry fight, and they are an anti-large. So I'll go and do a bit of a test. So you can see they're bigger in ardor, and they do have an anti-large true bonus versus large, and they don't have armor piercing per se. They're just a big anti-large unit. They are considered a damage dealer. They do have war paint. They have frenzy and physical resistance. So I wanted to put them up against another unit that is specifically anti-infantry at 900 gold, and that is the Greatsword. Now, Greatswords are a solid unit. We go back and look, and I think they're number 6. Yeah, they're show up in number 6 on this list. They are a good all-around unit. So when we put these two up into a fight, what should happen is the anti-infantry greatswords should mop the floor with the anti-large Savage Orc Big Guns. So let's go and take a look and see how that plays out. And I mean, you can do all kinds of back testing, but I just look at the really big ones and try to crying out loud. Of course, I didn't change the map. I just do the really big ones first and try to sort of understand from that what's going on, and if I made any large mistakes. And that's really, it tends to work out pretty well. So let's just see. Okay, small entity, start battle. Yeah, for a second I thought, well, maybe Savage Orc Big Guns are actually large and not small, but they are small. For some reason that just popped into my head that was a possibility. Alright, so we have our Savage Orc Big Guns, and we'll just get them into the fight with the great swords. And we'll fast forward that, and you can see right away they contact, and the Savage Orc Big Guns are winning, and the great swords are losing. Just right off the get. I mean, Savage Orc Big Guns have an awesome charge bonus, but the great sword should sort of catch up relatively quickly because they do have that anti-infantry. But you can see the Savage Orc Big Guns are pulling away at this point. They're winning fairly handily, and these are both units that are worth 900 gold. But the Great Swords are anti-infantry, and the Savage Orc Big Guns are anti-large. And that's exactly, the Savage Orc Big Guns won that pretty handily. You go to the end plates, the Savage Orcs still had about a third of their health, you know, a little more than a third of their units, 31 remaining out of 75, and they killed 77 of the Great Swords. So this is exactly what I'm talking about when I do the testing. I'll do back testing to make sure this makes sense. Now, look at some of the other testing. One of the other things I was surprised at is that the Forsaken were way down here at the very bottom. So one of the back tests I did, so I said, well, why don't I check against another unit that is like the Forsaken that is near the top? And I can do that because I can just grab a Lizardman, and we know the Saurus Warriors are 750, and they're very much like the Forsaken. Decent armor, not armor piercing, high weapon strength. And so we go grab the Forsaken, and the Forsaken are 750 as well. So both these units are 750, and they have sort of similar stacks, melee attack and weapon strength and charge bonus and whatnot. So the Saurus, really they are a very similar unit, but according to this testing, the Saurus Warriors are number 5 and the Forsaken are number 26. So the Saurus Warriors should beat the brakes off the Forsaken. They should beat them pretty handily. So we'll go ahead and run that test and see what happens. This is sort of the back testing. And if we go and do this back testing and it turns out the Saurus Warriors or the Forsaken are really, really level, or they beat the Saurus Warriors, then I know I got to take another look at what's going on and sort of see that testing for myself. So you can see both of these units are worth 750. They're both exactly the same type of unit. I mean, their armor's a little different, but there we go. The Saurus Warriors have beaten these guys pretty handily. We'll end that battle, and yeah, you can see the Saurus Warriors have half health left, and the Forsaken, have only killed 28. The Saurus Warriors have half health, a little more than half health, and way more than half their units, and they've kind of crushed the Forsaken. So then, that tells me that those two units are relatively reasonably placed. And then I look at a unit like the Foot Squires. So the Foot Squires, I think, is they were nerfed. They were at 650, which is probably reasonable. And I'll go over sort of at the end where I think units should be and why. I'm not going to go over Saurus Warriors with shields. I think it's pretty obvious that Saurus Warriors with shields in a value proposition should show up below the Saurus Warrior. And same with the Saurus Spears and the Saurus Spears with shield. I want to look at the Bretonnian Foot Squires, and this is I think a good example, because we look at the Foot Squires, and it's something I think that is very useful to talk about. Now, they are armor piercing, anti-infantry, and a damage dealer. So you would think they would have high damage output, and they sort of do. Their melee defense is low, and their melee attack is going to be higher with their infantry. Bonus versus infantry is going to be sort of like 34. So you would think that they would clean up, or at least have a pretty solid fight against Longbeards. Now, Longbeards I know are the creme de la creme, the gold standard for defensive infantry, but a unit that is more expensive than them, that is specifically anti-infantry, damage dealing, armor piercing, and armored against a unit that is defensive in nature and not armor piercing, should do quite well. So we get that fight going, and you can sort of see, now there's an aside or a caveat to this sort of testing, is that it also depends on where Bretonnian infantry are supposed to show up. But so we get this going. We'll get them fighting into the Longbeards, and they have a pretty good charge bonus. So they're winning right off the get pretty handily. But you can see the Longbeards really have an additional, 33 stat points minus the bonus versus large, which is 9. Bonus versus infantry, which is 9. So we're looking at sort of an extra 24 stat points. And you can see this is where, and I actually love how the Dwarfs play now in this game too, is they start to come on strong in the fourth quarter, and the Longbeards here are going to start to trade places with the Foot Squires. You can see the Foot Squires are starting to fade a little bit, and now the Longbeards are coming on strong in the fourth quarter, and they're gonna make this sort of a fight, and I don't know, are they gonna win this? I'm not too sure. It's really really close. But the Foot Squire should, I would think, win this relatively handily. But I run this, and the Longbeards will win sometimes quite reasonably. But you see, it is right down to the very end, and so I'm saying the Foot Squires here, yeah, they won, but not by much. So in that battle. So I have 63 kills for the Foot Squires, 68 for the Longbeards. The Foot Squires do start with 90, so I have 22 remaining. And I've run this where the Longbeards have won that fight, fairly reasonably. And this is kind of where I say this is a unit that is 25 gold more expensive going up against the unit it should do good at. And why does it show up sort of in this spot? And, at 650, maybe this is more reasonable. Now, those are some of the back tests that I've done to show that this testing is sort of reasonable, and it's put the units in a relatively correct position or not. And when I wanted to do a bit of a example of my thinking, and then go from there, and hopefully spur some conversation in the comment section to sort of how I think about this. And the way that I've set these units up is I've made it, the stuff in black here is really how I think conceptually units should stratify. And what I've got here is all of the armor piercing sort of anti-infantry type of units are at the top. So Chaos Warriors with great weapons, Longbeards with great weapons, White Lions, great swords, and Foot Squires should really be at the top according to just conceptually. Then you really have the units that don't have a lot of defense, but they are either anti-infantry or some other type of unit like that, which is, say, Saurus Warriors, War Dancers, Plague Monks, Witch Elves, Black Ark Corsairs, Marauder, Berserkers, and Forsaken. Then you have your defensive infantry, which is like your Longbeards, Chaos Warriors, and Saurus Warriors with shields, as sort of bringing up the rear. They'll hold the line for a very long time, but they're very good infantry. And then you get into your undead infantry, and this is where you have the Grave Guard with great weapons, your Tomb Guard, your Cairn Wraith, your Grave Guard, your Sirens, like that. And then finally at the very bottom, you should have all your anti-large infantry, which is, say, your Saurus Spears, your Savage Orc Big Guns, your Orc Big Guns, Savage Saurus Spears with shields, Chaos Warriors with halberds, halberdiers, Tomb Guard with halberds, and Slayers. And that's generally how I think they should sort of stratify. And when I'm talking about Foot Squires and where they should end up, conceptually I think they should be near the top because they are anti-infantry armor piercing damage dealers, so they should do really good in an infantry fight. But you may say that generally the quality of Bretonnian infantry is quite a bit worse, such that Bretonnian anti-infantry is still not as good as other factions' regular infantry, and then you would actually like to see the Foot Squires just below sort of the War Dancer, Plague Monk, Witch Elves, Black Ark Corsairs, Marauder, Berserkers, Forsaken. So just above the Longbeards, going from sort of rank 7 to rank 14, so they're still pretty good. You could say they are even so bad they show up worse than other factions' defensive infantry, so they show up below Longbeards, Chaos Warriors, and Saurus Warriors sort of at rank 15, but they would still be above Undead, because Undead cause fear, they're easy to heal, and they don't break. So that's sort of the idea that I would say conceptually for how infantry should stratify when you look at them. And when you have, because I think someone could easily get on board with, like, in any case, a Foot Squire, even if you bring them to rank 15 in this list, they would still go up 4 ranks. So they still need some sort of boost. You could easily make them more of a damage dealer, make their melee attack, keep their cost the same, make their melee attack 28 or 30, and keep their melee defense 20, and that makes them more of the unit you would expect them to be, type of thing. That's sort of how my thinking is. And Savage Orc Big Guns, if they are an anti-large unit, that they're meant not to be a big anti-infantry unit, you just reduce their stats by a lot and give them a big anti-large bonus. And bang, they'll show up down here in an infantry fight where they should, but against large they'll do really good. If they're meant to be an all-around unit that is good against everything, you need to drop their stats sort of a little bit, for they're going to show. Like, maybe they aren't meant to be an anti-large, maybe they're just meant to literally be really big savage orcs, and bigger and arter is not necessarily anti-large. Well, they still need to be toned down. Like, even in that case, they still need to be toned down because they are amazing against infantry and they're ridiculously good against large, right? So they got the best of both worlds when they show up like this. And this is sort of the small things that this sort of testing reveals, I think, in that you do see weird units like Savage Orc Big Guns. If any of you are playing the Greenskins, I hope you are already making good use of Savage Orc Big Guns in your builds, bringing, instead of none or one, sort of bringing 3 to 4 in a build and garnering some use out of that, or so that you can at least get some use out of that until it's changed. Or if it's never changed, you'll always get use of it from kind of coming along with me on this sort of testing journey and looking more deeply into these numbers. Now, when you look at, I come back to this often in these review videos, is when you look at the impact it has on new players, it really is significant. Like, you look at a unit like the Savage Orc Big Guns, they're coming in at 900, they're anti-large, you think that a unit like Greatswords should mop the floor with them because Greatswords are anti-infantry, and they should, but they don't. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you will not notice that in a full battle. A new player or a fairly green player is never going to notice these things in a battle that, that my picks are really letting me down because, there's something inside the game that's making them less effective. They'll just sort of lose and not understand why. And I think it's important to have units that be intuitive, so they do make sense and they perform to their description. Because when you look at this example, Foot Squires, which I think is a good example, they are armor piercing, anti-infantry, damage dealer. So a damage dealer, you think glass cannon, so generally their melee attack should be much higher than their melee defense. They're sort of like that. And these guys trade up, which is really good. They are anti-infantry, so they should do good against infantry, and they're armor piercing, so they should do good against highly armored infantry. Like, they should have no problem taking out Longbeards, and they should have no problem taking out Chaos Warriors, or they should easily take them out because of the nature of that unit. But they're vulnerable to missiles, they're vulnerable to other things, and that's sort of the game you have to play. But when you look at how people think about these units, they look at armor piercing, they think, well, they should do really good in an infantry fight against armor because they're going to get a little bit of work done. And if they don't perform up to their description, that really hurts new players the most, but it even hurts experienced players who are just trying to put together an army, because there are still lots of very good players that put together armies in the loading screen, right? They'll get a fight and they'll just pick their army out, and they'll often rely on what they know about a unit. Oh, this is an armor piercing unit, I need a little bit of armor piercing, therefore I will take this unit. And it turns out they don't perform quite how they should, and I think it's a problem, not as much for experienced players, because really experienced players will sort of end up having a feel for some units, but new players, it is actually very detrimental to their enjoyment of the game early. Because even when you're new and you're learning a game, even if you're losing, it's not too bad if things work out and make sense. Where you lose and you're like, okay, this makes sense. I allowed my anti-infantry unit to go up against large, or allowed my anti-large unit to go up against infantry. So therefore, when I go back and look at my battle, I can see this is somewhere where I can improve. But if you go back and you analyze and you say, well, a new player picked Empire Greatswords and he said, oh, perfect, I'm going to send these Greatswords against these anti-large Savage Orc Big Guns, and you get your tail whooped, you won't notice that specifically in the post-analysis. So that even though you made a good decision, you will get punished for it. And that's what I go over again and again and again in why I think the stratification is an important subject to tackle in terms of balance. And you can see like CA does spend a lot of time on balance, and generally, this game is pretty darn balanced when you look at factions as a whole. But I think it could be even better if you look at rebalancing some of these things within the factions. Like you can have a list that looks a little more like the list in black here, and still have total overall faction balance by balancing things up and down as a whole. I think quite reasonably, and you can sort of you can what would I say? You can actually amplify the unit's traits. So, for example, an armor piercing unit, you could, for example, if you wanted to amplify the armor piercing factor and make it so that non-armor piercing units do way better against units without armor, you could actually increase for example, their armor piercing, their total damage is 35, their weapon strength is. Their weapon damage regular is 9, their armor piercing is 26. You could actually change that weapon strength to 30 and make their weapon damage 4 and their armor piercing still 26. And then you go to a unit that doesn't have armor piercing and you make their regular weapon strength higher and their armor piercing lower to make those units show up a little more clearly in terms of stratification and the units they do good against. I know that in general they have, all units, can kind of get in there and have a fight. Like you can put pole arms and they'll defend for a little while and against an anti-infantry unit, and they'll get a little more damage done because they have armor piercing. But the idea being that you can amplify these traits so they more closely match the descriptions. And you can just change the descriptions a little bit and make it a little bit more clear. And you can even look at better faction descriptions. Like, for example, if you wanted to describe Bretonnian infantry as, you could say, an overall faction description, Bretonnia generally has amazing cavalry, but their infantry is not that good. Like things that would describe Bretonnia, like you have Bretonnia selected here. Some of the traits of Bretonnia above are X, Y, and Z. Maybe that would help the balance a little bit, but might help new players even more in terms of understanding what units they're picking and how, and getting the performance out of them that they expect. Anyways, that's sort of another discussion on stratification again, which is I think a continuation of the discussion we've had in the other two categories of testing, and some of the back testing that I generally do. I think clearly you can see foot squires. I think they should do really, really good against longbeards. They're even up against longbeards. Longbeards do win that fight. If you run it like 5 times, it's probably 50-50. Yet, these the foot squires are infantry that should do really well in that fight. And you can see Forsaken show up kind of where the testing said they should show up compared to Saurus warriors. And so that's kind of is given, I think, a reasonably good stratification of where things are. And it's showing that greatswords, I think, are in a solid position. Saurus warriors, white lions, I think, are in a solid position. Chaos warriors with great weapons are right where they should be, I think, according to everything. And you see units like plague monks, war dancers, sort of up there. I think maybe Graveguard with great weapons and Graveguard are probably a little bit OP. Not much. They don't need to be tweaked down much. We're not talking like massive amounts. But really, should they be showing up this high? Probably not. I think Sirens might actually be about where they belong, but maybe a little bit OP. I would think Karen Wraith should be a little stronger than Sirens because Vampire counts don't have ranged, whereas Vampire Coast do. You could make the case for either or, but I would think that Witch Elves and Blackheart Corsairs should show up a little higher, even without their ability Murderous Prowess proccing. And then you really should see all of the anti-large near the bottom to be intuitive. And you can give anti-large sort of different traits and sort of these don't all have to be perfectly stratified, sort of like a different layers of a cake. I mean, you can have the layers sort of intertwined when you get in there mixing, and you can have sort of some units that really outperform where you think they would, or outperform somewhat where you think they would be. They're a little not, maybe not OP, but strong for their position. But when you have units like the Savage Orc Big Guns coming in at number 2 in this, I mean, that's just not rational in terms of making a good game, I think. Although, people aren't using them, they do have some vulnerabilities, and they show up where they show up. So anyways, I would love to hear from you in the comments. There's really one more group that I'm going to test, and that's 901 gold and up. Really the tier 1 infantry. I haven't sorted out exactly what I'm going to test them all against just yet to try and get where those units show up. But I'm going to do a video before the primer. Before the primer, I'm going to do a video where I discuss where I think the unit should stratify. Like in this blacklist, where I think they should stratify, where I think they will show up. And then I'll ask, hey, where do you guys think they'll show up? Then I'll do the primer and show all the testing and the videos after that. That way I can sort of speculate as to where they should show up, where I think they will show up, and then see how close my intuition or our intuition is to the testing, because then you can go and look in the comments back on what you thought, because it was very interesting. I love the comments where people were guessing, hey, I think these units will show up here. Some people were right on the money with some of their picks, and some didn't quite show up just right. But it's really fun and very interesting to sort of think about where units are going to show up and why, and then to observe the testing and see where they go. I think this will be a little bit the most challenging test of the bunch, because we're getting to units that are absolutely insane. You're getting to I think it'll be a bit of a challenging test. Hopefully I'll sort of figure out what I'm going to test them against and get something up. Anyways, love to hear from you. Love to hear comments on where you think units should show up. If you think the way that I'm thinking makes sense in terms of the overall concept of stratification, and then further in terms of chaos and the Daoi should have very good infantry, because the Daoi don't have magic and cavalry and everything else like that, so their infantry really needs to be sturdy. And Chaos is known for their infantry and their armor and sort of things, whereas Bretonia doesn't need to have good infantry because they have amazing cavalry, so their infantry just sort of needs to be capable. And where do the undead show up? They should show up at the bottom half of the list. And where do the anti-large show up, etc. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I always look forward to comments, and I've said it so many times. I appreciate every single comment. I love them all. I love the just discussing the ideas, whether it's someone just stopping in to say hello, whether it's someone telling a joke, doesn't matter. Comments are my very favorite part of doing this and getting to share this hobby with you guys. It was really, really fun. So I look forward to hearing from you, and with that said, I will see you soon.